Welcome back, everybody. This episode is going to be another video in my aviation history series. This particular video is part one of a three-part series I'll be doing on the history of the P-51 Mustang. So part one will be the history of the P-51 development leading up to the prototype and the first production model. And then episode two will be about the P-51A through the Allison engine models into the Merlin engine, BC, and up to the D model. And then episode three, I'll be covering everything sort of after the D model. So the one-off prototypes, the P-51H, and through into the post-war development of the P-51 Mustang. So, as I said, this first episode is going to cover the development and the early history of production. If you're watching this video right after I upload it, episode 2 will be next month. Episode 3 will be the month after. So once those episodes get posted, I will have links to them down below in the description. If you're watching this after they got loaded, head to the description. You'll see links to the following videos in this series. So to get things started, I mean, the P-51 Mustang, considering how well known it is, considering how famous it is, considering most people call it the greatest fighter of World War II, very few people know the actual true history of the P-51 and the different models of the P-51. The amount of people I see online on forums discussing the P-51, and they get so much wrong about its early development as well as some of its later post-war development, and even in between, like the differences between a B and a C model, and the differences between the BC model and the D model. There's a lot of confusion in there about what actually went along with the development of these models. So hopefully these videos will help clear it up and give you guys a better understanding on what the different versions of the P-51 are and the actual developmental history of the P-51. So stay tuned. Hopefully you guys are going to get some enjoyment out of this. And here we go, history of the P-51. And as always, my name is Sean, and this, Sean's Aviation. Now, before we can start looking at the development of the P-51 in some detail, we're going to need to understand the circumstances that brought about the need for a P-51. So there is no single event, technology, or entity that brought about the P-51. It was a confluence of items, a perfect storm, if you will, that brought about what is arguably the best fighter of World War II. Every item that was included in the P-51 design was already developed, well known, and in most cases had already been used on a previous aircraft design. So the first thing we're going to look at is the seemingly unprepared state of many air forces at the beginning of World War II. So into the 1920s and the 1930s, most of the world's air forces were greatly limited by two main factors. One was the lack of money due to the cost of World War I and the ongoing Great Depression, and two, the belief by the respective governments that there would never be a large-scale world war again. Many thought that the horrendous losses of the Great War, as it was then called, that no nations would want to enter into another similar scenario. These two factors, along with a third internal short-sightedness that we will get to in a bit, led air forces to be content with a distinct lack of technological growth in the fighter plane. So let's take a look at some of the fighter aircraft from the mid to late 1930s. So first off, we'll look at the United States Army Air Corps' Boeing P-26 pea shooter. So here's a picture of a P-26. So as you can see, it is a low-wing monoplane, but it does have quite a bit of external supporting wires, a fixed landing gear, a two-bladed fixed pitch prop, and an open cockpit. So it first entered service in 1933. It was still in service at the outbreak of war in 1939, and some were still in front-line service when the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, mostly in secondary locations such as the Panama Canal and Costa Rica. So just to give you some stats on this, for example, the max speed, 203 miles per hour, and a max range of 310 nautical miles. So next up, we have the RAF's Gloucester Gladiator. So obviously a biplane, but fixed landing gear, a two-bladed fixed pitch prop. It did have an enclosed cockpit, which was quite a rarity for this sort of generation of fighters. So it actually, believe it or not, entered service in 1937, quite late for a biplane fighter. Still in frontline service in 1939 when World War II started, and it was officially retired from combat operations in 1941, with its last combat missions were being flown in the defense of Malta. So you can easily see that coming into power, into use in 37, still in frontline service 2 years later when the war broke out, but within 2 years was retired because the Air Force, the RAF, quickly realized that the aircraft was completely outclassed. So max speed, 220 miles an hour with a range of 220 nautical miles. So finally, we have the Armstrong Whitworth Siskin, which was the RCAF's primary fighter of the 1930s. So again, biplane, fixed landing gear, two-blade fixed pitch propeller, and an open cockpit. So this entered service in 1926 with the RCAF and stayed in service, only being replaced in frontline service with the Hawker Hurricanes at the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Speed 136 miles per hour and the range of 243 nautical miles. Now there were two exceptions when it came to advanced fighter aircraft from this sort of early to mid 1930s range. So they were both Germany and Japan, both of which had grand plans for a large empire. Both designed newer state-of-the-art aircraft, including fighters and bombers, and were able to test out their designs before World War II started. And that's a key point. What would become the Allies in World War II weren't part of any type of conflict prior to World War II for that decade of the 1930s, whereas both Germany and Japan both were. Germany in the Spanish Civil War, which was fought from 1936 to 1939, and Japan in the Sino-Japanese War, i.e. the China-Japanese War, in which began in 1937, continued through World War II, and only ended at the end of World War II. So let's take a look at some of the aircraft being flown by Japan and Germany at the outbreak of the war. So for Japan, we've got the Mitsubishi A6M0. Now, while the Mitsubishi A6M0 only entered service in 1940, its design was heavily influenced by lessons learned with its predecessor, the A5M. You can see a picture of the A5M here, and combat with the Chinese, which had started in 1937. The A5M was a low-wing monoplane, open cockpit, fixed gear, three-bladed variable pitch propeller. The U.S. Navy believed it to have been the primary fighter at the outbreak of the war, even though they had been mostly replaced by the A6M at the time of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The A5M was used by kamikaze pilots right up till the end of the war. So the A6M, low-wing monoplane, radial engine, retractable landing gear, three-bladed variable pitch propeller, and an enclosed cockpit. But again, this aircraft was heavily influenced by lessons that the Japanese had learned while fighting the Chinese and the A5M. So at the time of Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th of 1941, 420 were in service with the Japanese military, and it remained in production right up to the end of World War II. So a speed, you'll start to see the jump in speeds here, 398 miles per hour, and a range of 950 nautical miles. And with Germany, we've got the Messerschmitt Me-109, or Bf-109, depending on what references or what time it was built in. It started out as the Bf-109, later versions were classified as the Me-109. So the Me-109 is a low-wing monoplane, inline engine, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpit, and three-blade variable pitch propeller. So the Me-109 was a whole different beast from every other fighter of the time. It entered service in 1937, so just imagine that the very first version of the Me-109 entered service the same year that the RAF put the Gloucester Gladiator into service. And aircraft were immediately sent into combat in the Spanish Civil War. By the end of the conflict, April of 1939, the Me-109E, the fourth major production model, was in service. Continually updated using feedback from frontline pilots, this was arguably the best fighter in the world at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, with just over 2,000 built by the time hostilities commenced. It entered service in 1937, as I said, and was in continual production up to the end of World War II, with many airframes found partially complete at the end of hostilities. As well, a number of 109s continued to be produced post-war. The Spanish built a number using Merlin engines, the Hispano HA1112, as well as in Czechoslovakia, Avia made a number post-war, as well as updating the Avia, I believe it was called the S199, were actually built post-war using a different engine than the original ME-109 due to the lack of the original engine. So the ME-109 continued in production right up into the late 1940s, even into the early 1950s. So max speed of the 109, 331 miles per hour, with a range of 528 miles. So going a little later in time here, we look at Focke-Wulf, Germany with the Focke-Wulf FW-190. And due to lessons learned during early combat with the 109, in 1937, a new fighter requirement was set forth, resulting in the Focke-Wulf 190, which entered service in August of 1941. So the Focke-Wulf 190 is a low-wing monoplane, a radial engine with retractable gear and enclosed cockpit, and a variable three-pitch three-bladed propeller. So initially, most Allied commanders dismissed reports of a new fighter, attributing them to sightings of captured French Hawk 75 aircraft. It wasn't until June of 1942, when the RAF got their hands on one, that it was found to outperform the Spitfire 5, arguably the best Allied fighter at the time, and everything but turn radius. So the Focke-Wulf 190 entered service in 1941 and was still in production at the end of the war. Max speed was 426 miles per hour and a range of 519 miles. So now that we've seen where both Germany and Japan stood in the 1937 to 1940-ish range, let's take a look at where the Allies were. And on contrast, the Allies were woefully under-equipped due to the lack of funds and the belief that such aircraft were unnecessary. Seeing the unrest in Europe, war clouds on the horizon, and the newer, more advanced aircraft in service with the potential enemy, a last-minute rush to build already designed newer fighters were starting on both sides of the Atlantic. So the leading fighters in the RAF at the beginning of World War II were the Spitfire and the Hurricane, while the most advanced fighter in the United States Army Air Corps was the Curtiss P-40. While both the Spitfire and the Hurricane had been designed in the mid-1930s, production and entry into service had been significantly delayed due to government foot-dragging. So let's take a look at these Allied aircraft. So the Supermarine Spitfire from the RAF was a low-wing monoplane, retractable landing gear, inline-engined, enclosed cockpit, and a three-blade variable-pitch propeller. Now, the Spitfire was arguably the best Allied fighter at the outbreak of war, but their numbers were extremely low, with only 306 in service when war broke out. Designed as an interceptor, it had a very short range and could just make it across the Channel and back. It entered service in 1938, and the last one was built in 1948, with the final one not being retired from the RAF until 1954. So its max speed was 362 miles per hour and a range of 470 miles. So here we have the Hawker Hurricane, which at the outbreak of World War II was flown both by the RAF and the RCAF. So it was a low-wing monoplane, retractable landing gear, inline engine, enclosed cockpit, and a three-blade variable-pitch propeller. So the Hawker Hurricane was the most numerous Allied fighter at the outbreak of hostilities, with 500 in service. It entered service in 1937, and although its performance was significantly better than the fighters it was replacing, its construction, primarily wood over an aluminum box frame, was outdated when compared to other aircraft of its generation. Effectively, the Hurricane was nothing more than a monoplane version of an earlier biplane fighter. So the construction was very biplane-esque. However, it was a low-wing monoplane with all of the features of a modern aircraft. So this handicap would severely restrict its performance, and it was quickly superseded in frontline service. In the hands of the right pilot, however, it could still hold its own against the ME-109. So it entered service in 1937, and production was ceased in 1944, with the final one being retired by the RAF in 1947, although some Middle Eastern countries continued to operate them into the post-war. So max speed of the Hurricane, 340 miles per hour, with a range of 480 miles. And finally, from the United States Army Air Corps, we have the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. So the P-40 was a low-wing monoplane, retractable landing gear, inline engine, enclosed cockpit, and a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. So the Curtiss P-40 was the main United States Army Air Corps fighter at the time of Pearl Harbor, and it was based on the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, which entered service in 1937. First flown in 1938, the P-40 was first flown in 1938, and was ordered by the United States Army Air Corps in April of 1939. And there were very few in service when the war began in 1939. The numbers had risen considerably by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and a few were even based there and fought back against the Japanese. Although outclassed by most Japanese fighter aircraft, it was a stronger airframe, and with better armor and pilot protection, pilots were able to fight the enemy on their terms. Poor performance at high altitudes, due to a lack of proper engine supercharging, meant it was quickly outclassed against the newer models of German aircraft, although like the Hurricane, a good pilot could still hold their own. So the P-40 entered service in 1939 with the United States Army Air Corps, with the last one being produced in 1949, and the RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, not retiring them until 1947. So the max speed, 360 miles per hour, and a range of 650 miles. Now, let's compare what we have seen so far and condense it down into one easy-to-read chart. First, we will look at speed. Here are the 6 main aircraft we have talked about, and here are their respective speeds. As you can see, the Focke-Wulf 190 takes the prize. But to look at what would have been on the European front in 1939, the Spitfire was the fastest. Now let's take a look at range. As we can clearly see, the Zero has the best range. But using the criteria from above, only European theater in 1939, the Me-109 has the best range. However, if we look at the Allied aircraft available, the P-40 is clearly the best available, with a speed only marginally slower than the Spitfire and a range almost 50% longer. Now, remember that internal short-sightedness that I mentioned earlier? Let's take a closer look at that. So in 1921, an Italian general, Giulio Douhet, hopefully I pronounced that properly, my Italian accent is horrible, he wrote a treatise titled The Command of the Air. He had been in charge of building up Italy's military in World War I and used this experience along with the evidence from German Zeppelin bombing to formulate this treatise. In it, he proposed that since aircraft would be operating in the third dimension, ground forces would be relegated to a secondary role and the vastness of the sky would make defense almost impossible. He believed that the only way to win a war was to have a large bomber force and that only a good offense could be a good defense. This stance completely blinded him to the prospect of aerial defenses and believed fighters to be, quote, useless, superfluous, oh my god, I hate this word, superfluous, and harmful. I apologize for me butchering that word. So both Hugh Trenchard of the RAF and Billy Mitchell of the United States Army Air Corps were devout followers of Douhet's theories and pushed for a very large strategic bombing force. One result of these theories was that many governments were deathly afraid of being attacked from the air and would do anything to stay out of conflict. The idea of a total war where unescorted bombers would bomb civilians in order to break the morale and end a war in a matter of days was too much for many politicians to handle. This in part fueled both British appeasement as well as US isolationism. So while England and the US pushed a strategic air force to the detriment of fighters and defense, the Germans went down the path of a combined tactical combat style that became known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was a completely different style that combined medium bombers attacking larger targets and dive bombers attacking smaller frontline targets with fighters providing cover. These forces would be working together with mobile, mechanized ground forces to wear down and overrun positions extremely fast. Since most combat was planned to take place close to the front lines, range was not a significant need in German designs. As such, Germany never built up a large, heavy bomber force. Now, when hostilities started in 1939, the RAF began a limited bombing campaign against German forces in the Channel area, occupied France, and to a lesser extent, Germany proper. They very quickly learned that most of Douhet's theories were wrong. Fighters were able to knock down bombers flak was a serious threat, and bombing would not cause an enemy to surrender within a few days. Rather than face the fact that the theories were wrong, the RAF switched to night bombing in order to avoid the losses from enemy fighters. This is almost like covering your eyes while your bedroom is on fire. You never see the flames, but trust me, they are still burning. Now, due to the switch to night bombing by the RAF, a few things happened. There would be no need for a fighter escort, as it would be too dangerous to attempt this in the dark, and night fighters were not a very serious threat at this stage. And precision bombing would be next to impossible. A thorough investigation would show, post-war, only 1 out of every 100 bombs dropped would land within a 5-mile radius of the intended target. This did end up fulfilling one of Duhat's predictions. The only way the RAF could hit a target would be carpet bombing the entire area. Later in the war, under Sir Arthur Harris, this would evolve into a total war morale bombing that Duhat first envisioned. The US, on the other hand, were set on daylight pinpoint strategic bombing. The key to this theory was the extremely advanced Norden bomb sight, which you can see here. This was initially designed for the US Navy, but the US Army Air Corps quickly adopted it for the B-17 and B-24 bombers that were coming online. The predicted accuracy after static tests would see a target of 15 square feet hit from an altitude of 30,000 feet. The key word there is predicted. Once in combat, this accuracy was measured to be roughly 50% of bombs hitting within a quarter mile of the target. Still better than the British, not quite pinpoint accuracy. As with the British, flak and fighters took a murderous toll on the bombers. The United States Army Air Corps Bomber Command believed, however, that a large force of heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive box formations would be able to fight their way in and out of a target area without undue loss. On one of the worst missions of the war, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17th of 1943, 55 bombers out of a force of 346 were lost, a loss rate of almost 16%. Escorts consisted of Spitfires and P-47s, almost all of which had to turn back before the German border, leaving the bombers unescorted for almost the entire flight. On October 14th, Schweinfurt was attacked again with 291 bombers, 60 of them being lost, a loss rate of over 20%. The escorts were almost identical with the first raid and with almost an identical outcome. This led to a 5-month hiatus on deep penetration flights by the United States Army Air Corps and a rethink about the escort fighter. P-51s would not arrive until late in the winter of 1943. So let's sum up what we have. Germany is using short-range, blitzkrieg-style bombing. The RAF is bombing at night with no practical need nor way of escorting them. And the United States Army Air Corps, up until late 1943, adhered to Duhat's belief of the useless, superfluous, and harmful escorts of fighters. Clearly, the bomber barons had no use for a long-range fighter. With no Air Force looking for long-range fighters before the war, many would be scrambling when war broke out. In the beginning of 1940, even before the beginning of the Battle of Britain, with Germany's stranglehold on the continent and the fall of France imminent, the RAF realized that the only way to hit the Luftwaffe would be to do it on their ground. With the Spitfire and Hurricane's ranges both sitting in the 470 to 480 mile range, if you remember that chart from before, something with longer legs would be needed in large quantities, and needed fast. Now, in May of 1939, with war clowns looming, the French Air Force purchased 140 P-40s to help bolster the obsolete aircraft currently in service with the relatively small French Air Force. With the fall of France in June of 1940, the order was transferred to the RAF, with the first P-40 arriving in England in September of 1941. So to facilitate the purchase of more US equipment for the war in Europe, the British and the French set up the Anglo-French Purchasing Commission. With the fall of France, the English took over the commission, becoming the British Purchasing Commission. Now, during early of 1940, there were only 2 off-the-shelf American aircraft available for the RAF to purchase that would fulfill the long-range requirement, the P-38 and the P-40. Now, if we go back to that chart, you'll remember that the P-40 had a speed of 360 miles per hour and a 650 mile an hour range, while the P-38 had a top speed of 415 miles per hour and a 1,000-mile range. So the RAF wanted to purchase both types, and the commission approached both Lockheed and Curtiss with the possibility of purchasing their respective aircraft. Now let's take a look at the RAF P-38, which is a weird story in and of itself. So Lockheed was more than happy to make a sale, and in March of 1940, an order for 667 P-38s was placed, split between the British and the French. Since the French had already purchased the P-40, the commission requested that the P-38 be equipped with identical engines in order to facilitate repairs and spares. This meant that instead of counter-rotating turbo-supercharged engines, they received two right-hand turning supercharged engines. You can clearly see the difference between the two models in these pictures, with the turbo supercharger on the US model and none on the RAF one. This drastically reduced speed at altitude, as well as caused tremendous torque due to both engines rotating in the same direction. Their entire order was transferred to the RAF with the fall of France, and after the experience and lessons learned during the Battle of Britain, the RAF reconsidered and changed the order so that 143 would be of the original design and the final 524 would be identical to the US AAF model with the turbo superchargers. The final nail in the coffin for the RAF P-38 was due to other issues with the aircraft design itself. The P-38 was one of the first aircraft to encounter compressibility. And this is when the air is being compressed in front of the airframe as the speed approaches the speed of sound. This caused numerous loss of control and airframe breakup incidences, and it wasn't until 1943 that this was finally solved by adding quick-acting dive brakes under the wing and filleting around the wing cockpit engine nacelle area. These modifications reduce the ability to reach the high speeds where compressibility occurs and reduce the tail buffeting at those high speeds that cause the loss of control, respectively. The RAF, however, canceled all the early design lightnings due to these issues before the tail buffeting situation was solved. Lockheed tried to hold them to their original contract since they would lose approximately $15 million in the canceled sales, and negotiations stalled until the U.S. Army Air Force took over the entire order after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now let's go to the P-40. At the time of the commission approached Curtiss in early of 1940, the French order still stood, and the United States Army Air Corps had 524 on order on the order books. Now Curtiss's P-40 manufacturing facility was based just outside of Buffalo, New York, and the factory was at capacity with these two orders. With no other facility to produce P-40s, Curtiss had to turn down the RAF order, but would allow the commission to approach other manufacturers with the offer to build P-40s under license. So North American Aviation just happened to be in the right place at the right time to make history. The company had just finished the B-25 design and had sold 184 units right off the drawing board to the United States Army Air Corps, and had approached the British Purchasing Commission to see if they would buy some as well. This was right at the same moment when Curtiss gave the RAF leave to look for a new builder for the P-40. The RAF had a very good relationship with North American Aviation, having purchased both the NA-64 Yale, 119 of which were delivered to the RCAF, and the AT-6 Harvard, 400 Mark 1s and 1,173 Mark 2s were delivered to the RAF. And the RAF already knew the company and what they could expect. When asked to produce the P-40, the company management balked at building someone else's aircraft and believed they could build a better aircraft with the same engine in the same time it would take them to tool up for the P-40. The design team had already had the basic design of a high-performance fighter dating back to mid-1939, and it wouldn't take much to modify it for the British requirement. They then tried to convince the RAF to let them build a new, clean sheet design. The RAF was initially skeptical, as North American Aviation had, up to this point, only built training aircraft and the B-25, but reluctantly agreed to hear a proposal. In January of 1940, Dutch Kindelberger, North American Aviation president, and Lee Atwood, the vice president, proposed the production of 320 NA-73s with the following conditions requested by the commission. It must be powered by an Allison engine. It must cost no more than $40,000 per airframe. Be delivered no later than January of 1941. be equipped with British radios and armament, the Browning 303, same machine gun that was installed in the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. In April of 1940, the British Purchasing Commission accepted the proposal and North American Aviation had to come up with a design. The company representatives spent the next 3 weeks in a New York hotel, the British Purchasing Commission was located in New York City, hastily drawing up general arrangement drawings, which the British Purchasing Commission quickly approved. There was one more hurdle to overcome. In order to sell the aircraft to a foreign government, the United States Army Air Corps and the U.S. government had to give their blessing, effectively turning away any chance of acquiring the aircraft themselves. Within a month, North American Aviation had a release in hand. Remember, the P-40 was in full production, the P-38 was nearing entering into service, and the P-47 was just starting to take shape, not to mention this was seen as a contemporary to the P-40, not an improvement. 2 copies, however, were to still be provided to the United States Army Air Corps for testing. On May 29th, the British Purchasing Commission officially placed the order for the first production aircraft and officially named the aircraft Mustang. So this now brings us up to the design of the P-51. So North American Aviation design team decided to incorporate as many new features into the aircraft as possible. New aerodynamic breakthroughs, as well as lessons learned in combat over Europe, were combined in a way that had never been seen before to create this iconic aircraft. Despite the fact that the British order gave them 8 months to produce the prototype, an internal limit was agreed to, one of 120 days. This was selected as it was the time it would have taken the company to tool up for the P-40. One stipulation the RAF did put down was that North American Aviation was to get as much aerodynamic and technical data from Curtiss as possible, as North American Aviation had very little experience designing high-performance fighter aircraft. One of the most iconic elements of the P-51 is its enclosed radiator sitting farther back on the fuselage. This design had been tried a few times before, mostly by Curtiss, but never successful. The trend at the time was to mount the radiators and oil coolers either under the wings, as in the Spitfire or 109, under the nose of the engine, such as the P-40 or Lancaster, or in an under-the-fuselage bathtub. The Hurricane had a radiator that, on the surface, looks a little similar to the P-51's design, but it has the aerodynamic qualities of a barn door. North American Aviation originally designed the P-51 with an enclosed radiator similar to the final product, independently, but after receiving the data from Curtiss, it was able to use the initial results from the original design of the XP-40 and the one-off XP-46 to get the most out of the design. Here we see the XP-40, and here is the XP-46, and as you can see, the rough beginnings of the P-51 radiator design is evident. This radiator design incorporated many new features that had never been seen on a production aircraft. Its streamlined enclosed scoop was blended smoothly into the rear fuselage, greatly reducing drag, and it had an inlet and exhaust doors that could be moved to adjust the amount of airflow through the radiator to control engine temperatures. The initial design had a few issues, specifically lack of adequate cooling, and it wasn't until the B model, when the radiator scoop was lowered below the boundary layer of the lower fuselage, that the problems were rectified. The adjustable exhaust door had an added feature that was not fully taken advantage of until the B model came along, which was, when set to a smaller size than the intake area, it would create a minor thrust action. Here is a diagram of the system as it would have been on the B model. Here is the oil cooler, and here is the radiator. When the air comes down the intake at the front, it was slowed, heated by the radiator, then the hot air is squeezed out the back, very similar to how a jet engine works. Although this didn't create very much thrust, roughly 300 pounds, it was enough to offset whatever drag the radiator created, effectively making it a zero-sum addition. Another aerodynamic revolution that was added to the P-51 was the laminar flow wing. Officially designated the NACA 45-100 airfoil, NACA standing for National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the forerunner to what we now know today as NASA. While the principles were known back in early 1939, it was one of the first laminar flow designs used on a production aircraft. The laminar flow wing is one where the boundary layer does not break away and you get a layered effect as the air moves over the wing. While having a true laminar flow wing is almost impossible in realistic scenarios, the wing that was used on the P-51 was about as close as you can get for its performance envelope. The design works by moving the thickest part of the wing farther aft, delaying the boundary layer separation point. You can see the difference in the wing shape and the separation point in this picture. This design keeps induced drag low even at high airspeeds. The story of how North American Aviation got the laminar flow data is worth taking a look at. So the original design of the P-51, as selected by the RAF, did not include the laminar flow wing. One of the aerodynamicists on the team, Edward Horkey, knew about the work being done at NACA with regards to wings and insisted they incorporate this into the design. As the aircraft was being designed for the British, North American Aviation wouldn't be able to officially ask for the data, so they worked around the system to get what they needed. They sent one of the design team members down to Wright Field, where NACA was based, to gather as much data as he could from NACA about the tests. And when Eastman Jacobs of NACA came out to visit the North American Aviation factory in California, he was convinced to take on part-time work and help mate the laminar flow wing with the P-51 fuselage design. The laminar flow wing has another interesting property. It has more internal space than a standard wing of the same area. This made it easier to fit all the necessary items into the wing. It had a wide track landing gear mounted in front of the main spar, which retracted inboard so the wheels would rest under the fuselage. And it had fuel tanks, 85 gallons each, behind the main spar on the inboard sections. Outboard of the wheels and fuel were the guns and ammo tracks, which went out to almost the tip of the wing. While the armament changed considerably throughout its life, the prototype was designed with 150 cal and two 303s in each wing, and two 50 cals under the engine in the nose. The engine that was selected for the aircraft was at the time the only practical engine available, the Allison V1710, the same engine that was fitted to the P-38 and the P-40. At this point, the Merlin was only being produced in England, and it was impractical to ship the engines over to the US, considering the U-boat threat currently in the Atlantic. The engine was mated to the fuselage using a new aluminum box frame rather than a tubular steel frame, which made the engine mount smaller and lighter and allowed for the two machine guns to be fitted below the engine. Here you can see the Spitfire's tubular steel frame, and here you can see the aluminum box frame used in the P-51. This is a D model, but there was only minor changes in the mount between models. The overall design was to be as aerodynamic as possible. The cowlings were fitted as close to the engine as practical, and with the radiator located behind the wing, the cowlings had no bulges or protrusions other than a small intake above the nose for the carb. The fuselage cross-section was kept to an absolute minimum, with even the canopy partially buried into the fuselage sidewalls to minimize the protrusion into the slipstream. The canopy was a flush design, with the top opening upwards to the right while the left side swung down, and the right side was fixed in place. Both the main and tail wheels were fully retractable, with doors covering the openings completely. Unique to most aircraft of this time, the inner main doors stayed closed, only opening during the retraction and extension sequence, although they would droop down slightly as the hydraulic pressure bled off after engine shutdown. This not only kept drag to a minimum, but allowed undisturbed airflow into the radiator. The fuselage and wings were flush riveted, and all seams and joints on the inner portions of the wing were filled, sanded, and painted in order to maintain laminar flow and make the wing as slippery as possible. Even at the end of the war with the natural metal P-51s, this practice was continued and the wings came from the factory painted silver. There was also an extensive use of compound curves to eliminate as many 90-degree angles as possible. In order to get the aircraft out of the door in 120 days, many of the systems used were ones that were already in use on North American Aviation's other major designs, like the AT-6 Harvard, including the hydraulic system, wheels, brakes, electrics, and control lock mechanisms. Being able to incorporate existing technology and systems allowed North American Aviation to get the prototype out of the factory in a remarkable 102 days, meeting the timeline set. But it took another 20 days for the engine to arrive, since they had to wait in line behind the P-40 and the P-38. While many talk about the aerodynamic leaps that were made with the P-51, it is easy to see how North American Aviation used existing designs and systems, combining them in ways never yet seen before in order to make what would become World War II's best fighter. In September of 1940, even before the prototype made its first flight, the RAF purchased an additional 300 units. So now that we've seen the design work that went into the background, we now get to the first flight and a few teething troubles. So on October 11th of 1940, the Allison was started up for the first time and the P-51 came to life. For the next 15 days, all the systems were checked and rechecked and taxi tests were carried out. On the morning of October 26th, the aircraft was deemed ready to fly and Vance Breese was the lucky man to make the first flight. He took off, retracted the gear, and began the initial test. After 20 minutes airborne, the aircraft touched down. All test points were met and most were exceeded. All the people present, the North American Aviation reps, RAF reps, and the United States Army Air Corps reps, were all excited about the success of this first flight. Flight tests continued with success, other than a minor cooling problem, until disaster struck on the 8th test flight. On November 20th, 1940, during the 8th test flight, the prototype crashed only 12 minutes into the flight. Just after takeoff, with Paul Belfour at the controls, the engine quit, and despite doing everything he could, it would not restart. He was unable to make it back to the runway and decided to dead stick into a nearby farmer's field. After lowering the gear and flaps, he put it down just east of the runway. Once the wheels hit the freshly plowed earth, the aircraft immediately flipped over on its back and was extensively damaged. So much so that it was thought it would never fly again. The cause of the problem turned out to be a simple one. The engine had been starved of fuel. Further tests showed that there was an aerodynamic effect with the carburetor intake that caused the engine to stall under certain power settings. A lengthened carburetor intake was the ultimate solution to this problem. The prototype would not fly again until January 11, 1941. Despite this setback, the data collected in the first few flights impressed the British, and a further 300 were ordered, with some minor modifications due to combat lessons learned during the Battle of Britain, bringing the total to 620 airframes. The first production aircraft, AG-345, made its first flight on April 25, 1941, and was officially accepted by the RAF on May 1st. This aircraft was subsequently kept in California by North American Aviation for further tests, and the second production aircraft, AG-346, was the first to be delivered to England on October 24, 1941. Here you can see it in RAF markings before it was modified with the longer carburetor intake. This aircraft was used by the RAF for initial trials, and although the speed was high, faster than the P-40 and the Spitfire Mark 5B of the time, its performance above 11,300 feet tapered off dramatically and was almost uncontrollable at 26,000 feet. Due to this limitation and the fear that spares would be difficult to obtain, the aircraft was officially assigned to the Army Cooperation Command for low-level attack and reconnaissance, and the Spitfire would be kept as the main day fighter. The RAF's trials found some very interesting points to note. Despite having poor high-altitude performance, the early P-51 still had a 1 to 2 mile-per-hour speed advantage over the Spitfire Mark 5B at 25,000 feet, and was faster at any altitude below that, and it could outdive a Spitfire with ease, but had a poorer climb rate. Now, obvious when you remember that the Spitfire was designed as an interceptor. The view sideways was found to be slightly poor due to the horizontal frames of the canopy, but no worse than a hurricane. It was found that the Spitfire could outmaneuver the P-51 at all altitudes, but the P-51's ability to dive away from the fight from straight and level, incurring negative Gs, and the ability to hold the accumulated speed longer after recovering from the dive allowed it to leave and re-enter the fight on its terms. Overall, the RAF was happy with the aircraft. The first P-51, or the Mustang 1 as the British called it, entered service with 2 Squadron RAF in April of 1942. Now, as we have seen, the RAF had been the main client at this time, but now the US government get their turn, eventually. Just after the prototype crash, the United States Army Air Corps, under the conditions set forth when the aircraft was first sold to the RAF, requested 2 airframes for testing purposes. These were delivered to Wright Field as XP-51s and stored on a seldom used area of the base. The first on August 24, 1941, and the second on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor. On a side note, the first XP-51 delivered to the United States Army Air Corps still exists and is on display at the EAA Museum in Oshkosh, as seen in this picture, and was flown regularly for much of the 1980s. The long delay to delivery to the U.S. Army Air Corps was due to North American Aviation working out a fix to the engine stalling problem, the backlog of RAF aircraft, and the priority given to other aircraft entering service with the United States Army Air Corps. A crash test program was instituted in early 1942 when the U.S. realized it would be entering combat in the near future. A letter from Colonel Homer L. Sanders, dated August 26, 1942, commander of the 51st Fire Group in India flying P-40s, shows the uphill battle that was fought by P-51 proponents within the United States Army Air Corps. In it, he stated that some of his pilots had test-flown the P-51 back in 1941 and found the aircraft superior to the P-40, and put all the blame on the United States Army Air Corps for the lack of a suitable fighter in theater. He claimed the aircraft was put on the back burner because it, quote, "It was a North American aviation project, and Materiel Division, United States Army Air Corps, could claim no credit for it." During early January of 1942, He had contacted a senior officer at the flight test section at Wright Field and inquired about the P-51. At first, the officer wasn't sure what he was talking about, then commented that there were a few sitting around, but they, quote, didn't look like much, so we haven't bothered much with them. Colonel Sanders requested that he be re-equipped with P-51s, which was 2 years later. There were a few other voices pushing for the P-51 to enter service with the United States Army Air Corps. One of these was Colonel Oliver Eccles, who was in charge of experimental aircraft for the United States Army Air Corps. He was initially against the building of the P-40, claiming that a slight delay in production will allow a more technological aircraft already in the pipeline to proceed into production, namely the P-46. He clearly was ignored. The U.S. did start buying P-51s, but in a roundabout way. In March of 1941, the U.S. government passed the Lend-Lease Act. This more or less barred the selling of war material to the European nations to keep the veil of neutrality, but allowed the U.S. military to purchase items, give them U.S. serials and designations, then lend them to other forces, being paid once the war was over. Under this system, the United States Army Air Corps purchased 150 P-51s for the RAF on July 7th of 1941. These aircraft were a slightly modified version with the nose guns deleted and the wing guns replaced by 4 20mm cannons, the same as the Spitfire. These were delivered to the RAF as Mustang 1As. With the favorable data coming out of the XP-51 testing and the push by certain members of the United States Army Air Corps, Colonel Eccles was able to negotiate a deal where only 93 of the Mustang 1As were delivered to the RAF, with the other 57 going to the United States Army Air Corps as the P-51. 55 of these had reconnaissance cameras fitted and were given the designation F6, while the other 2 were kept for engine tests. The first flight of the United States Army Air Corps, now known as the United States Army Air Force P-51, took place on May 29, 1942. The United States had finally entered the stable. So this now brings us to the end of episode 1 in this series. So episode 2 hopefully should be released next month, and episode 2 is going to go over a breakdown of each version of the P-51, starting with the prototype and then going through up until the P-51D. And for every version, I'll be going over what changes were made, how to quickly and easily differentiate between the different versions, as well as the reasoning why these different changes were made. So as I said, about a month I should have that released. If you're watching this after a month has passed, then down below in the description I will have links to episodes 2 and episodes 3 once they're released. So if you don't see a link down below, you'll have to wait till the middle of the next month. So hopefully, if all goes well, this will be released in, I'm hoping July of 2020, if not August of 2020. So the next one will be either August or September, depending on when this one gets released. So as always, guys, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for episode 2, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.